Brace yourselves. In this video, we're diving into Des Moines Con 2023. The show was earlier this month, and now that the dust has settled, it's time to talk about it. I've got this video packed with exclusive footage straight from the bustling show floor just for you. Now, let me tell you up front, this convention was a blast. You know, it was filled with great books and good friends, but truth be told, despite the positive experience, the convention kind of turned out to be a humbling lesson in passion versus profit. However, fear not, the disappointment of a less than lucrative event couldn't dampen my enthusiasm for sharing this adventure with you. In fact, I can't wait to reveal the treasures I managed to snag during my time at Des Moines Con. So join me in this roller coaster of emotions. You all know how emotional I can get as I take you through the highs and lows of Des Moines Con 2023. All right, let's hit the floor. My first stop was at a great inline booth. I generally try to avoid inlines and stick to corners when I'm setting up at shows, but this vendor does it right. Push the table back, pull the people into your space, but for me, nah. I've got too much junk and I like to leave myself plenty of space to work on things while I'm at a show. That said, this guy also had some great stuff. He had one of the side walls that had some more affordable books on it, a back wall with a great mix of gold, silver, bronze, modern, you name it. And this guy also had some great slabs in the boxes, but I especially loved that little tabletop rack that he had kind of in the corner that had some fantastic Spider-Man keys on it. The other side wall also had a great assortment of sets and some additional slabs there. All in all, really thought this was a good looking booth. Next door was a pretty impressive double booth, I gotta say. And really, this guy had a few different things going on. First up, I noticed his dividers. You kind of see me taking a look at them there. I'm not 100% sure, but it really looked like he may have actually stripped some real comic books and taken the logos for those dividers specifically. And yeah, I think the dividers look great, but I don't know that I could ever bring myself to do that. Next thing is the table's full of art prints that he had that were out front there. Those were something I've never really seen before. These prints were scans of original page art from classic artists, classic titles. And like I said, that's just something I hadn't seen before, and I thought it was pretty cool. There was some McFarlane stuff, some X-Men stuff. It was pretty neat. This booth was well stocked with the usual mix of silver, bronze, and copper, but one thing I especially enjoyed was what was titled the Fun Box, and that was just full of comic-related stuff. It had some Wizard and Toy Fair magazines, TV guides, just all this weird ephemera, you know, stuff that's related to comics but is not actual comics. I've really come to enjoy seeing that kind of stuff lately. But I have to say the main thing that caught my eye here at this booth was the complete mirage run of TMNT that he was selling. Issues 1 through 62, and it had a bunch of extras with it as well. Unfortunately, he didn't have a first print number 1 or the NYCC variant of number 3, which are the main two books that I still need, but you know, what can you do? Our next stop was over at the booth of our new friend Airboy Comics. He was a local collector and dealer who focuses mainly on Golden Age and pre-code horror books, and as you can see, he's got some amazing stuff. He had a pile of L.B. Cole books, one of only 3 issues of Tales from the Crypt in the whole room, and in fact, the 3 of us standing there talking and looking were the only dealers that had any Tales from the Crypt issues in the room at all. If you wanted one, they could only be found at our booths. We each had a single issue, so it's just so hard to find that stuff anymore. And then how about that Startling Comics number 49? Restored or not, that book is an absolute beast. It was just cool to see. I really enjoyed his booth overall, and I hope to run into this guy again at some other show down the road. Next up was the vendor with probably the best location in the room. He had a whole half island right in the middle of the room. You couldn't hardly go anywhere on the show floor without walking past him one way or the other. He had tons of mostly modern stuff and some good variants, but what really caught my eye were the long boxes that were full of cartoon character books, including a couple of books that you might recognize from some recent top 10 lists that I've done, including books like The Disney Afternoon #1, Mega Man #1, Pokemon #1, and so on. So many great IPs were in those boxes. I was digging for some titles that I collected in my very early comic collecting days. Things like Now Comics' The Real Ghostbusters, Archie Sonic, and titles such as that. But around the corner, I would find something pretty cool. This dealer had just picked up a great original owner run of Amazing Spider-Man. And while they weren't all in the box for the video, the dealer said that the run was mostly unbroken and that it started all the way down at issue number 2. Now, the best stuff he'd already pulled out and had sent off to CGC, and overall, the books were extremely well loved and pretty rough in general. But they were also affordable, and there's a lot of collectors out there that are budget oriented that are going to be very happy as they fill those holes in their early ASM runs, and they will still have some money left over for McDonald's afterwards. Our next stop is a pretty straightforward comic booth, though they did have a lot of slabs, and while they didn't have much that caught my eye for the most part, the dealer did tell me that they had just got a box of slabs that were fresh back from CGC, And that's actually where I found one of the books I was most interested in for the whole show. I'm always on the lookout for 9.2 ASMs under 100. And honestly, it's pretty rare that I find one out in the wild. Unfortunately, the price on this one was just way too high. At the time of the show, there had only been 3 sales in all of 2023, and the highest sale was under 270 bucks. So 450 and even the $400 the dealer said was his bottom dollar were just both way too high for me. It's just another classic example of high-grade Silver Age filler that looks great, but doesn't really mean it's worth a bunch of money. Next up, I hit the far side aisle of the vendor floor. My first stop over here was at a great vintage toy booth. They had some awesome TMNT, Motu, G.I. Joe, Star Wars, and really just about any other 80s or 90s toy line you could possibly want. Even including a tiger shark. It was beat, but to just see one of these things is pretty rare anymore. And even though I couldn't get a good shot of it, they also had a G.I. Joe USS flag set up at the far end of their booth just as a display piece. They had jets parked on it. It was pretty impressive. It was just too crowded to get a good shot of it in the video. Had we had an amazing show, even a good show, I probably would have gone back and picked up that unpunched Horde Trooper that I was looking at. I love that figure, and that's really one of the cleanest carded Motu figures I've ever seen firsthand. Down the aisle were a couple of comic vendors, and I gotta say, I felt bad for these guys. As rough as I had it location and sales wise, these guys had it even worse. They had some good books, and the first guy even had some nice graded VHS tapes. You know, some of your favorite 80s titles were in there, and as I recall, I think that's the first time I've ever seen graded VHS at a show. Now it's time to check back in at HQ. I like to swing by from time to time while I'm out wandering around and make sure everything's good. It was, and now I'm headed off to the No Coast Comics booth. They were kind of back just behind us a little bit, and they are the folks that are behind the comic shell that I featured here on the channel just a while back. After a little chit chat there, finally, I'm stopping by the most jaw-dropping booth at the entire show, the All-American Comics booth. Gene Carpenter, who you saw me talking with earlier in the video over at the Airboy booth, has honestly forgotten more about comics than any of us will ever know. Gene is so incredibly knowledgeable and friendly. In fact, he just seemed kind of familiar, and it took us a while, but we realized we'd met him before down at OFCon before the pandemic. So he was a familiar face, and it was good to reconnect with him and look forward to seeing him again at another date. Great guy. Unfortunately, I didn't get much of his booth on camera because it was always pretty busy. He was always busy. His buddy was helping him was pretty busy. But here's a quick highlight list of some of what I saw at his booth. There were more Golden Age keys than you could possibly count. Just great Golden Age titles. He had the only AF-15, Amazing Fantasy 15 in the room. He had a nice copy of 4-Color 16, which is the first Mickey Mouse comic book. He also had rows and rows of unbelievable pre-code horror, including Harvey file copies, a really great run of upper mid-grade ECs, just crazy stuff. The video here ends kind of abruptly as I was moving out of the way of a guy with a camera shooting the same booth. It turned out he has a YouTube channel called Jacob Comics, and then the next thing I know, I'm doing an interview for his channel kind of on the fly. So if that's something you want to check out, head over to Jacob Comics and, give a search. It should be one of his more recent videos. And I've saved my favorite booth for our last stop here as far as the floor footage goes for Des Moines Con 2023. This is Majestic Collectibles. I wound up hanging out in this booth for a bit and had a great chat with the owner, who is a Des Moines local with some good books and what is hands down the best assortment of late 80s and early 90s cartoon comics that I've ever come across at a show. Here's a quick accounting of some of the titles that caught my eye, and you probably saw some of them on his wall and in the boxes as well. He had Beavis and Butthead, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Beetlejuice, TMNT, Masters of the Universe, Back to the Future, Crash Test Dummies, Sonic the Hedgehog, Captain Planet, and The Real Ghostbusters, just to name a few. Full disclosure, it was the nice spread of Sonic issues on his wall that pulled me into this booth, but as luck would have it, every single issue they had, I already had. Those are just the breaks. One thing that was interesting though, there were multiple copies, 3 to 4, 5 or 6, or even more of a lot of these issues that they had in stock. I don't know, it was probably like an old store stock or something they bought out, but it was nuts to flip through that many copies of some of those old books. You can even see some of that on the wall with the Sonic books, and it carried over into the box stock as well. It was really a great booth with a lot of unique product, and I really enjoyed digging through it. So now let's touch on my thoughts about the show in general. As for how the show went, well, honestly, it wasn't great for us. I knew when the vendor map was released that we were likely going to be in for a long weekend, as we were just the third booth back from the exit doors. And we were also well removed from most of the other comic dealers. You had to go past several booths to find other comic dealers before you got to us. Unfortunately, I was right. That's just how it went down. Sales on Saturday weren't too bad, a little under what we did each day at Indy, but I kind of expected Des Moines to perform under Indy, so that wasn't so bad. but unfortunately Sunday was just a poor day all around. Talking with the dealers that were more centrally located out in the room, they didn't share that experience, especially on Sunday. They were still busy and having good sales and doing well. So I really think our location is what hurt us the most. I'd be really curious to know how that show would have gone if we were kind of less out of sight, out of mind, and would have been grouped together with most of the rest of the comic vendors over in the center of the room. Ultimately, I think it's just another example of a show that is primarily more of a pop culture show than a comic show. And it's getting to be a more common thing as larger shows lean into cosplayers, voice actors, wrestlers, and other types of celebrity that it's associated with various fandoms. And that said, from a promoter standpoint, I get it, they must be doing something right, as there were good crowds back in the celebrity area throughout the weekend, and when they passed out applications for next year's show, it was revealed that they were bumping it up to a 3-day show. So, like I said, they've got to be doing something right. Unfortunately, as I was reading the application, that also means extra day, extra cost. Booth prices were gonna go up too. As for the behind the scenes stuff, load in, load out, they weren't too bad, but I do have to say the dock was pretty short staffed. And at one point on both load in and load out, the whole dock ramp filled up with vans and trucks, basically to the point where you couldn't get a cart up or down and in between the vehicles at certain points. It got to be pretty hairy. In that regard, things could have been better. It was funny, looking back, Des Moines and Indy couldn't have been more different really in that regard. At Indianapolis, there was a huge crew managing the dock, the parking area, and just loadout in general. At Des Moines, there was one guy trying to handle all of it. He was a good dude. I talked to him several times over the weekend, nice guy, and he did his best, but it was him versus an entire horde of vendors and artists and celebs all trying to get the hell out of Dodge, AS, AFP. And honestly, he just didn't stand a chance in those circumstances. Though Des Moines is at the outer edge of my preferred travel range, the drive wasn't bad. And it was enjoyable to be back in the area again after last being there, really, I think it was over 15 years ago. It will be fun to come back to this show in the future. It wasn't a profitable show for us, but we had a blast. The hotel was great. We barely scratched the surface of the list of food recommendations I received. And if we were just in town to shop, I think we would have had just a fantastic weekend of buying, meeting members of the community, and otherwise enjoying a good old-fashioned comic book road trip. While I didn't go wild with the spending, typically there's a pattern here. You may have noticed that I don't spend much unless we're having a good show. I don't know why. I just, selling a lot makes me want to spend money. Selling a little makes me want to not spend money. I don't know why it is that way. That said, I did manage to snag a few books while we were at the show. Starting off, I picked up a few of those copies of The Real Ghostbusters. And as you may have seen in the clip earlier, I spent a bit of time digging through some of those Real Ghostbusters books at the Majestic Collectibles booth. And I wound up going back later in the show. I think it was about the last hour or so on Sunday. And luckily, some of the issues I'd scoped out earlier, they were still there. I picked up issues 26, which is this guy. Also got 27 and 28. If you're not really familiar with the series, these are the last 3 issues of the first volume, the main series that most people think of. There was a second volume that was just 4 issues, but some of these later issues can be tougher to find. So, finding the last 3 issues of the original 1988 series from now, they came out back between October and December of 1990. It was pretty exciting. Additionally, I also picked up the 1992 Real Ghostbusters Annual, which has a cover that I really like. It takes me back to those Saturday mornings where, you crawl out of bed, you fire up the TV bright and early for a morning full of cartoons, probably some cereal and some good times. And last but not least, I'm checking off a box on my 2023 want list with this copy of Darkwing Duck #1. Excited about this one. I also picked this up from Majestic Collectibles, and I was really pretty happy with the deal we made. The Ghostbusters books were marked a little high for my liking at $10 each, but I paired them up with this Darkwing Duck, and I wound up getting the whole lot for 50 bucks, which I was pretty happy with. Each and every one of these books were just 100% pure nostalgia for me, and really, I kind of needed the lift after what had been an admittedly disappointing show. Darkwing Duck 1 is the character's first appearance. As we mentioned before, when it was on a top 10 list, it came out in November 1991. Just great classic Disney early 90s stuff. Definitely got a soft spot for Darkwing Duck. And if you noticed in one of the clips earlier, I found a Disney Afternoon #1, and I almost went back and picked it up, but I wound up talking myself out of it. Honestly, it was just kind of as much fun finding it out in the wild as it would have been to bring it home. So I saved the 25 bucks that I think it was, and just, let the next person have it. While sales weren't what we'd hoped for, we still had a good time at the show. The hotel was fun. We found some fantastic food while we were up in Des Moines as well. And unfortunately, I just don't see us returning for 2024, at least not as vendors. The show's going from 2-day show to a 3-day show, and that means higher booth prices, an extra night in the hotel, and so on and so forth. That said, I think that Des Moines Con may be a fun show for us to hit up just as attendees, as a good weekend getaway to chase some books and hang out with some of our friends from the north. It was good to see some familiar faces and to make some new friends as well. I look forward to doing it again. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. Collect responsibly, and I'll see you in the next video.